Believe it or not, when you're piecing together a turbo kit, there's actually a number of things you have to do. And depending on how custom you're going, there's always going to be a certain set of steps you're going to have to cross. And we've been slowly working our way through it for the TT. Not only have we picked the parts and test fitted those parts together outside of the car, but we even took a stab at removing the stock turbo. Although, we really didn't get nearly as far as I wanted to. And that's all because of two heat-cycled bolts that rounded. I had actually hoped they were never going to be a problem. But that's kind of the thing when you're working on an old car. Sometimes, no matter how well you plan things out, no matter if you're using the right tools or the right method or anything like that, sometimes, for lack of better terms, things are out of your control. And detours are part of the process, as annoying as they can be. So if last episode told the story of how we got ourselves stuck, this episode should tell the story of how we get ourselves unstuck. And I have pretty high hopes for making more progress today. After all, it's just two bolts. Two tiny little bolts connected to the turbo and the manifold. Sure, they're stripped and heat cycled beyond belief, but hey, how hard could they really be? This week, I arrived having absolutely no idea what I got myself into. I had even partially convinced myself it was going to be easy. Little did I know just how naive I actually was. I ended up doing quite a bit of research on removing stripped bolts, and here's what I've found as a potential option. The internet has told me these bolts are likely made out of titanium. Lovely. So I figured we'd go through quite a few drill bits to make a dent, starting with these, which I saw as expendable. And I figured if the cheap set didn't do anything, we'd upgrade to these two Milwaukee bits, which claim to be able to go through metal. And if even those don't work, we've always got our friend the Dremel. Maybe this tungsten carbide bit will help. And as a wild card, since I was genuinely curious, is this speed out kit. At this point, I was fairly convinced that at least one of these would help. So I figured I'd start with the wild card. The whole deal with these is that they drill a small hole in the center of the bolt, and then the other side is going to grip that hole. Then, allegedly, you can twist the bolt out just like normal. And believe it or not, they actually drilled into the bolt quite well, and quite quickly at that. These were on sale, and despite my very limited hopes, they actually held a decent amount of torque for what they were. For a second, I started to get excited, and then, as I expected, they let go. I guess we do actually have to drill this out. And believe it or not, this started quite well. Those Milwaukee bits ate chunks and chunks of the bolt until there was a pretty notable hole in it. But the issue is after just a little bit, they lost their effectiveness. They were hardly digging anymore. It felt like they were really just polishing it. So I brought out the Dremel to see if that would do anything. Alternating back and forth between drill bits and the Dremel, different Dremel bits and drill bits, we started to make some decent progress. There was actually a fairly deep hole in the bolt. At this point, we were maybe a centimeter or two deep. And that got me thinking. I'd read stories online of people heating up the hole that they drilled in a bolt internally and then jamming a Torx bit in there. In theory, it would be enough grip to turn the bolt. So that's exactly what I did. I hammered in my 1/2-inch drive Torx bit while the inside of the hole was piping hot. And believe it or not, it was holding. This was by far the most amount of force I was able to put on this bolt. This could be it. I was hopeful at this point it would just come out, so I gave it a try. But then, reality set in. In trying this, I made things a whole lot worse. If you thought drilling through the bolt was getting too easy, don't worry. This bit is an even harder metal, much more difficult to drill through, and it's jammed in there so tight that it's not popping out. We're in this for the long haul. In all honesty, there's not really a pretty way to do this. Grinding the top of this off was probably the most time-consuming thing I have ever done. I spent a really long time trying to pry out the little bit, but nothing was really working. Part of me thought it almost welded itself in there from the heat, so I spent hours. Actually, if I'm being honest, this took almost an entire day, going through bit after bit after bit. At this point, the drill wasn't doing anything. My only real hope was the cutoff wheel with the Dremel, which somehow was cutting through it. But even then, the access was so bad and it was at such a weird angle that I was going through discs left and right. After almost a full day of work and hundreds of dollars in tools which are now useless, I did eventually grind the entire top off. And if I'm being honest, at this point, I was really happy, but I was also concerned. The tool that was doing the most for this bolt was the cutoff wheels. And that's all well and good until you realize that the other bolt that's stuck doesn't have access for the cutoff wheels. They're simply too large to fit down there. So all we really have that can fit down there are the drill bits and the tungsten carbide Dremel carving bit, meaning this is going to take even longer. And based on the pace I was really hoping to achieve, I was well past time, which if you're like me and a slave to a plan you set, is pretty tough to handle. It's the next day, and if I'm being honest, I'm a little stressed out. We are pretty far behind pace, but that's kind of par for the course when working on 20-year-old cars, especially when bolts like this are seized and just a pain to get out. I have parts for both the E30 and the S4 that are also in the backlog, but hopefully you guys understand it's a little hard to justify stopping progress on the TT, which is currently not drivable, to work on those cars which are drivable. We were making some progress yesterday, but we're just so far behind the pace that I wanted to achieve, but a lot of it's taking hours to grind these. I woke up this morning, ran to the store and bought another $100 of drill bits and Dremel bits, and hopefully we can make progress today. That's my goal. I was trying to maintain a sense of hope this whole day, but I was struggling pretty hard. I guess you could say I was just feeling a little discouraged. It's a strange feeling trying to keep pace and having something out of your control happen that really kind of ruins that. And if I'm being honest, it takes quite a bit to get going and to keep trying, especially when there's not really an easy way to do what you're trying to do. It's just time passing through your fingers, wasting away. Nothing you can really do about it. And at the end of the day, that's kind of what gets to you. Time is incredibly limited. You're only given so much. And if you're anything like me, you work full time. If you're lucky, you get 2 days a week free. So spending the entirety of the time you have free during a single week, making seemingly no progress doing the same thing over and over and over again, that is not fun. And at this point, I was in pretty deep. I was struggling mentally, the Dremel was dying, I was getting frustrated. As far as working on cars, this was a pretty big low. And in situations like this, sometimes the best thing you can do is change your perspective. Below the car is like a different world when compared to what I'd been seeing for the last 3 days. Under here, things were easy again. And to get the turbo off eventually anyways, we're gonna have to get these out either way. So I figured while I couldn't do anything up top, I could do a lot down here. And sometimes all it really takes to switch up your mood is to change what you're doing. In my case, I decided to remove all the manifold bolts I could, as well as the different lines to and from the turbo, namely the oil feed in return and the coolant feed in return, or at least what I could reach easily from down below. There's an oil and a coolant line that feed directly to the block and then back up to the turbo. And even though the fluids are drained, when you remove these, they are going to leak out a little bit. Definitely don't be caught off guard by this. I also went ahead and removed the turbo support bracket. At this point, there's only a handful of things holding the turbo on. We have an oil and coolant line on the top of the turbo. Those are easy though. The main thing holding it up is still that manifold bolt. And I was out of time and bits for the day. We were going to have to come back yet again, starting over effectively. But maybe that's not a bad thing. There were other clearance issues that I was still trying to figure out at the time. There's a small Allen bolt that holds a coolant line onto the turbo, and that's another place where the turbo is supported. The issue though is it's seated right behind a hard coolant line, and there's absolutely no space to get a bit back there without bending it. And I don't want to strip it because we know what happens there, so I felt pretty stuck. I was going to have to do a bit of research and pick up some new tools to make this possible. But at the end of the day, it's not a bad thing to take a step away from things for a little bit. And sometimes, if I'm being honest, that's all you really need. When you're frustrated, it helps way more than you would realize. Once again, I returned to the store, grabbing a couple more bits and some new tools. At the time, it can be frustrating taking a step away from something you're actively working on, a problem you're trying to solve. But what it does do is allow you to come back level-headed, and you sure think a lot clearer when you have a positive outlook. So, as weird as it sounds, on this 4th day of trying, I had hope again, and some more tools to help me out. For that tiny Allen bolt, a friend of mine recommended some of these ball-end bits. I've actually never used them before, and honestly, now I can say they are some of my favorite things I have used. If you've never seen them before or used them before, it's pretty simple. They're round on the end, so you can use them at an angle without stripping the bolt. Sometimes all you need is the right tool for the job, and with it, that bolt came out like nothing. And believe it or not, with the same tool, I was able to reach the coolant line on the top of the turbo. A double win. And now to the elephant in the room. Really, at this point, the only thing holding the turbo to the car was what was left of the bolt we've been grinding for the last 2 days. And with more bits and a fully charged Dremel, we were good to continue. I would say we had ground it down about 75%, and what little remained was still holding strong. This was still taking forever. But then, something caught me off guard. I could have sworn I saw it move. Quickly, I grabbed the hammer-on bolt extractor. I needed to know if I had gone crazy or if the Dremel had somehow broke it loose.
Nuh-uh. No. No. I'm sorry. I thought it just moved. I thought I just saw something. No! Oh my god! I spend weeks, 3 days, and it's hand tight now. What is this? What is that? God damn it. Are you serious?
Turns out the easiest way to remove a bolt is to literally Dremel the entire top off, and then it'll start spinning by itself.
I am so stoked. I was prepping for the worst. I thought we weren't going to be able to do this, but we might actually make some progress today. I needed this after so many days of it just not working, so I'm excited.
This bolt was the source of a lot of pain. Without it, we can move again.
You lucky right-hand drivers can pull the turbo without pulling the manifold to get yourself some more room. Us, with left-hand drive cars, can't exactly do that.
Even though the turbo is just hanging there now, we still have to remove the manifold. There's just not enough clearance to pull the turbo without first pulling the manifold. The right-hand drive cars have the brake lines on the other side, so they got more clearance. But with the rest of the manifold bolts removed, I was ecstatic. The project was back under my control. Now all we really had to do was catch up to the pace I wanted to be at. And with the manifold out, the next step was pulling the turbo, which, if I'm being honest, is a pretty sweet moment for the car. This here is what a 170,000 mile KO4 looks like. Oily, leaky, grimy, but free. And sitting next to the manifold, you can really get a perspective on just how tiny everything is. The runners are small, and honestly this whole setup doesn't look like it would flow nearly as well as it felt like it did. But the cool thing is, we can fix that.
Here comes the fun part. Test fitting all of our new parts on the car and seeing what all we really got ourselves into.
One of the most satisfying parts of installing a new turbo setup is in the name. Everything is new. There's no bolts to fight with, no rust, nothing is seized. It's all on us now. So the best first thing to do is to get the manifold in place and see if it's actually going to work with the car. Remember, we've only really tested this all outside the car, so we have absolutely no idea what kind of clearance issues we're going to run into. So before we get too ahead of ourselves, we need to get everything bolted up to the car like it's supposed to be. That way we know if everything is actually going to fit. It's also going to give us a rough idea of what the turbo is going to look like on the car. And since our manifold is a top mount, it's going to completely change the way this bay looks. First things first, it is cool that all these bolts are accessible from the top now. Props to the manifold design. Second, the turbo is going to look absolutely great up here. Third, however, the clearance. As you might have noticed, we've got a couple issues right off the bat. The main one is that you might notice that the outlet of the intake side of the turbo is pointed directly at the block. That's not good, so we're gonna have to make some adjustments. And based on how it's sitting now, we're gonna have to rotate it about 90 degrees. And if you've never seen this done before, it's known as clocking a turbo. Analog clocks rotate, and so does the front of a turbo. By taking the bolts off the back of the turbo, you can rotate it so that it's pointing whatever direction it needs to be pointing in. That way you can make your charge pipes whatever you need them to be. In our case, we just need to move it roughly 90 degrees up. And since you're curious, here's what it looks like next to the stock KO4. While it doesn't completely dwarf the turbo, it is notably larger and will flow a ton more. And while we have everything this far apart, we might as well go one step further and clean up the engine bay a little bit. This engine has way too many vacuum lines on top, most of which come from this system right here, the N249 system. That might change though. At the most, I'm going to completely delete it, or at the least, I'm going to relocate it so that you can't see it. I'll likely do the same thing with the secondary air injection system, so let me know what you think would be better. Either way, just moving this out of the way starts to make the engine bay look a lot nicer. It also gives us the clearance needed to get the turbo back there. And with it back there, we can start planning the next steps. We're gonna have to make a couple connections. Namely, we're gonna have to make a new charge pipe since the old one is far too long. We're also gonna need to get this O2 pipe in place to start measuring for the custom downpipe. And it turns out the limited clearance means this actually has to be the first piece of the puzzle that goes in the car. So we're gonna have to basically assemble it back here, which with all the room isn't even that bad. And what do you know? It fits just fine. That doesn't mean it's all straightforward from here though. We're gonna have to do quite a bit of custom work. We'll have to figure out what we want to do with the N249 system, as well as reroute a couple lines so we have the clearance to make the rest of the kit. As you can see, the intake won't exactly get very far without these being rerouted. Thankfully, I have a couple ideas for this. Just gotta wait on a couple parts. Overall though, I couldn't be happier. I think once this is all said and done, it's gonna look great. The only other real concern I have is that this line right here is hitting the O2 pipe. Obviously, we can't let that happen, so we're gonna have to reroute that as well.
Well, it does look like everything fits, which is awesome. However, there are a couple clearance issues that we're gonna have to deal with, namely the heater cores for the intake and I believe a power steering line that is touching the downpipe. All things we can fix, but it's something for us to be aware of.
Speaking of the downpipe, I actually think it's going to be a little more simple than we first thought. From here you can see where that O2 pipe lets out and it's pointed directly at the old downpipe hole. So I'm thinking we just measure the old downpipe and weld on the right flange. I would definitely appreciate any tips you have on measuring that though. I would hate to cut it too short. This was a very interesting week of progress on the car. It had some of the highest highs and the lowest lows in this entire build. The struggle of grinding those bolts was tremendous, but the fulfillment of seeing the new turbo on the car, even though it's not bolted, far outweighed that. And I can't wait to get it set up. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider dropping a like and subscribing for more. That's the best way you can help support me and my channel. Either way, I'll see you guys in the next episode. Thank you again. Have a wonderful day.